In this tutorial, I will show you how to set up a lighting effect using trigger points and material glow. If you want to set up a scene where a lot of lights may be involved, you will need to consider using material glow as a way of doing that, because Sandbox will only support using around 32 lights before it crashes. So I'm going to show you how to set up a proximity trigger and connect it to an object's material parameter using a Flowgraph so that you can change its glow amount. I have already set up my scene with an object I wish to use as my light. In this case, a lantern shade. First, I need to create a trigger for my light. So click on Entity and Triggers and Proximity Trigger. If you want to produce an irregular trigger shape, you'll need to use an area trigger along with an area shape, but we're going to use a proximity trigger as it's quick and easy. Drag it into the world and place it. Now you'll need to name your trigger, something sensible so you know what it's doing. So I'm going to call mine Lantern Trigger. Next, I want to change the size of my trigger. Now do not use the scaling tool at the top here, otherwise your trigger won't actually scale. It'll look as though it has, but it won't in fact have scaled. You'll need to use, under Entity Properties on the right here, the X, Y and Z parameters. So I'm going to make my X parameter 20, my Y parameter 10, and my Z parameter 5. Next, I'm going to get the Move tool, and I'm just going to adjust my trigger so that it's exactly in the right spot. Make sure that the top of your trigger area does not fall below the surface area and the bottom of your trigger area is not hovering above your surface area, otherwise it won't work correctly. Also, you need to make sure that only player is ticked as true if it is your player that you want to trigger the light. If you're going to use an AI to trigger the light, then you'll need to tick only AI. Now we're going to make our flow graph. If we want to have several identical lights coming on when we enter the trigger area, then we need to put the flow graph on our light. But if we want to use several triggers to turn on a light, then we need to put the flow graph on our trigger. I want to turn on lots of lights, so I'm going to put it on my lantern. Click on your object, go to Flow Graph and Create, select New for a new flow graph and call it something sensible so that you know what the flow graph is doing. I'm going to call it Lantern Glow and then say OK. Now we will create our nodes. To start off, we need a start node. So right click, add node, miscellaneous and start. Next we need a node for our trigger. So go into your game, click on your trigger, go back to your flow graph plane, right click and say add selected entity. And this brings up the proximity trigger node. Next we want to get the material parameter. So we're going to right click, add node, go down to entity and then to material parameter. Here you can see it is asking us to choose our entity. So we want to make our lantern shade glow. So click on the object you want to glow, go back to your flow graph plane, right click on the choose entity and say assign selected entity. And here graph entity has appeared in that box. That's telling us that this object is the one with the flow graph attached to it, so it's the graph entity. Next we want to copy this node, so click on the node, Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and an identical one appears. This is going to be our default. So we want to make it so that our default glow amount is just at 0. So here we have the value float at 0, and then click in the parameter float and type the word we're going to now connect our start node to the default parameter. So we're going to click from output to get the default parameter. Next, we're going to go from our start and say, when we start the game, let's enable the trigger there. Then, once we are in our trigger, when we enter it, we want to get the material parameter, and while we're inside it, we want to change the value float. Click on your material parameter here, and over in the parameter float, type glow and enter. That tells us that we're going to change the glow amount. And then at the value float, select a number. I'm going to use 10. If it's a darker material, you'll need a higher number. If it's a more transparent material, you'll need a lower number. And press enter. So this is our completed flow graph to trigger our light. I can now close this and go and see if it's working. So we're going to run into our trigger area, and there our light has turned on. When we go out of our trigger area, our light has turned off. So in and out. So it's working correctly. Now I'm going to show you how to create a lot more lights using the same trigger. So we want to go and select our object. Mine is made up of two parts, so I'm going to hold my control key down whilst I left click on the other part of it. So I have the two objects selected. Next, I'm going to click on the Y axis because that's the axis along which I want to copy. So I'm going to go Control C, Control V, and then I can just move along the Y axis and click it into place. Again, Control C, Control V, and one more time, Control C, Control V. Let's go over here. There. Now that's done, we can run into our world and see if it's working. There, all our lights turned on, and then when we run outside, all our lights are turned off again. So you can see how you can copy your object multiple times to create multiple lights that will trigger on when you enter the trigger area. The only important thing is to remember that your flow graph must be attached to the objects that you wish to copy. I hope you have found this tutorial useful, and you can now find other ways to create interesting lighting effects. Thank you.